Pacific Research Institute podcast. I'm your host, Rowena Ichon. This is PRI's 50th podcast, and for this episode, we have a special guest, George Gilder. His classic book, Wealth and Poverty, made the case for advancing capitalism and supply-side economics. Today, he is one of the world's leading experts on technology and innovation. In this podcast, I sat down with George Gilder at the Heritage Resource Bank Conference in Fort Lauderdale. George and I had a wide-ranging discussion, from the state of Silicon Valley to the threats to innovation, his views on basic income, and of course, the new technologies that we should all be looking for in the future. We think you'll enjoy this. Welcome to PRI's podcast, George. It's an honor to have you on PRI's 50th podcast. So PRI is based in San Francisco and a stone's throw away from Silicon Valley. So I would be remiss if I didn't launch the first question about the Valley. In your opinion, what is the state of Silicon Valley today?
Well, I think it's in the process of having a nervous breakdown. It's completely failed to supply security for its products. And security isn't optional in a system that actually focuses on transactions. And the only answer of Silicon Valley to the breakdown of security manifested everywhere with millions of usernames, passwords, expiration dates, social security numbers lost is to demand more passwords or more complicated passwords or more intricate, interconnected passwords. And the whole system has collapsed. And while Silicon Valley speaks of attaining some singularity where human brains are transcended and machine intelligence, I think it's a combination of delusions of grandeur and a collapse of the actual technology that they are responsible for maintaining. And meanwhile, the heart of Silicon Valley is the startup culture. That is what made Silicon Valley what it is. That's what all these companies came from. And the startup culture is broken down into a queue of unicorns outside the M&A offices of Google and Facebook, and a 90% drop in IPOs, and mostly profitless companies with big burn rates. The venture capitalists seem to be chiefly preoccupied with diversity programs, which is what happens when you become too political. You become a honeypot for politicians, but they don't have any capability of resisting, and various sickly door with a pale cast of green goo. I just think that Silicon Valley is not healthy. They do have four of the great companies in the whole world, Silicon Valley and its extensions in the north that also have many outposts in Silicon Valley, to Amazon and whatever, Apple, Amazon, Google, and Facebook, and Microsoft are among the top 7 companies in the whole world in market cap, which is quite a huge triumph, and it allows everybody to imagine that a triumphal Silicon Valley in the face of what I actually think is a crisis at the heart of their economic model.
So if Silicon Valley is in a state of crisis, what's next? Your upcoming book is called Life After Google. What does that life look like? What does it mean?
It means that emerging is what I call a cryptocosm. It stems from the other side of the same technologies on which all the great companies of Silicon Valley are founded. The information theory of Claude Shannon and the computer technologies of John von Neumann and Alan Turing, and all these had another side, which was cryptology, what Neil Stephenson describes in Cryptonomicon, the whole problem of ascertaining truth amid noise and deception. From this technology has emerged Bitcoin and the blockchain and the hash graph and a whole series of new ways of using cryptographic insights to develop technologies that have a ground state, that have security first rather than security as something applied by SWAT teams of hackers after the barn door is long down. And I think that the new blockchain and cryptographic technology is fully comparable to the dot-com and internet technology of the late 90s. It's a fully comparable efflorescence of creativity and innovation that will have just as big a transformative impact as the original technologies that generated Apple and Google and Facebook and Amazon and all the rest.
So what kind of technologies can the consumer expect in the next 10 years that are going to be real game changers?
The consumer can expect to have a return to markets, for one thing. Consumers aren't actually involved in free goods. If your goods are free, you don't have customers. As Tim Cook of Apple said, if the service is free, you aren't the customer, you're the product. And that's really what we're doing, and we're trying to turn human beings into products and then transcend their very minds in artificial machines in vast data centers that supposedly collect all the digital information in the world and rise on a crest of new consciousness beyond the reach of mere individual human beings. And I believe that the security collapse is the other side of this idea that individual human beings don't matter anymore, that really we are the last great humans. We've created the technology that's going to transcend ourselves and bear us into eternal life on some spaceship somewhere. And so I think that whole Google vision is inherently anti-human and will fail because it's wrong. I got 100 arguments in my book, but it's not going to work.
Anti-human, so does that mean anti-freedom and?
Anti-freedom, anti-human, of course. I mean, they believe in the materialist superstition. They don't think that there's any. They think there's one answer. They think if you get if you get the right algorithms and right data, and you process it, you come to one answer. And that really doesn't leave room for human creativity and surprise. And all innovation is really surprising. If it wasn't, human creativity comes as a surprise to us. If it didn't, we wouldn't need it, and socialism would work. And I believe that Silicon Valley has adopted a kind of new Marxism. It seems peculiar, but I think that the current Google philosophy, they don't know it, but it really completely repeats the Marxist mistake. And the Marxian mistake was to imagine that the Industrial Revolution of that era was the final technology, that the future would be a matter of distributing abundance rather than creating new things.
How did this progressive culture gain purchase in Silicon Valley, particularly when so much innovation and lots of fortunes were made thanks to free markets and capitalism? How did this culture come about?
I think it's this new Marxism, as I've described. It's pretty pervasive. It's combined with people don't want to recognize how incredibly inimical to human progress is the idea that CO2 is a poison. This is a fundamental belief that somehow human beings pollute the planet and that human industrial activity is somehow menacing and really has to be suppressed. They don't believe any longer in the great adventure of creative human progress, which really is the heart of capitalism. Capitalism is meaningless for a stationary state. And they imagine that because they're just dealing in ideas rather than, that they're in information technology, that they can sort of escape the problems that face industries, which have places and ties to communities and emit fumes of transform chemicals into products. They imagine that somehow they're above that process.
California's left-leaning bias is becoming more extreme, and yet these policies have failed California. California has the highest poverty rate in the nation. Affordable housing is at a crisis level, poor performing public schools, transportation gridlock. All of these are seriously eroding the quality of life in the state. The middle class, along with the wealthy, are now moving out. What do you think is the state's long-term future?
Well, you can't have a cult of an anti-human green cult that imagines that the planet's going to fall on our heads if we keep moving and creating, and build a lot of houses and make housing into an actual innovative product. Ordinarily, when that would be the response. Right. But instead, they have these zoning rules and just massive environmental crusades that are funded by billions and billions of dollars from Silicon Valley leviathans. And there's just a fundamental conflict between these two themes, the theme of wealth creation and the theme of wealth suppression or of productive suppression.
So do you think that the most innovative technologies will emerge outside of the valley?
Well, really, much of the important technology of Silicon Valley now comes from Israel and China. China is the source of industry. China has not abandoned industry and production.
Even as they are communists, or say they are.
Even though they're communist. Actually, the amazing thing about Communist China is they have smaller government, at least as a share of GDP, than we do. Substantially smaller. It was last estimated around 17% of their GDP. Now maybe, the actual control of companies renders more of the Chinese economy actually an expression of state power. But on the other hand, with incredible rise of the administrative state that suppressed new company formation in the United States and resulted in a 50% decline in the number of public companies on the stock market and a 90% decline in the number of IPOs. We too, it may be that China actually has a substantially less intrusive government than we do. It's hard to believe, but if you really scrutinize the ambitions of an EPA that wants to control every emission of carbon dioxide, which is the very substance of life, it creates us all, we really have reached the end of the line for what I think is the prevailing philosophy of Silicon Valley that also has prevailed widely across the whole country. And I think that the rise of the rebellion of this philosophy is really enabled by a monetary policy that is utterly unsustainable. The drive for sustainable technology is supported by the idea that you can print money at zero interest rates in unlimited volumes without any payback.
That's actually my next question. What are the biggest threats to innovation in your opinion?
The world has $257 trillion of debt right now. The governments have all adopted the idea that they can essentially emit money, that money is something they print rather than something that measures the value of what's produced. And I believe money is intrinsically a measuring stick, not a magic wand for central banks. And the whole current world economy is sustained by this vast theft from the future, which can only be repaid by dispensing with this anti-production, anti-creation, anti-human philosophy, that virtualosophy, as I once called it, of Silicon Valley.
There's a lot of support for basic income from Silicon Valley executives who believe that technology will soon displace a lot of low-skilled workers. Stockton is already starting a pilot program to give $500 a month to families to spend the money on whatever they like. What's your opinion on basic income?
I think the whole theory is just preposterous. It's just nutty. It has no validity, zero validity. There's no evidence that the advance of technology destroys jobs. As people become more productive, unless the technologies are like the new Silicon Valley fantasies of technologies that supplant human minds. I mean, if you're trying to build technologies to obsolete human beings rather than to make them more productive, then of course you're going to believe that only a guaranteed income can keep people alive. But that's just delusional. It's just idiocy. There is no evidence that technology destroys jobs, period. And anybody who thinks there is just doesn't know economics. The advance of technology has employed China and India, and they're just fabulously more jobs than there were before the rise of technology. And as technology is deployed, more jobs are created. It generates the capital that endows new work. And if it doesn't do that, it's bad technology and will not be profitable and will fail.
Cities nationwide are laying all sorts of tax incentives and other benefits to lure many tech companies such as Tesla and Amazon. Is government distorting the market?
What's happening here is the real collapse in IPOs and business starts is the real phenomenon, with more and more of the wealth gravitating to these few huge companies that buy up their rivals and potential rivals, buy up their own shares with money generated by government at virtually zero interest rate. It's that cycle that is evident here. If there were lots of new companies rising up, there would be less of an obsessive drive to get the new Google data center or the new Amazon data center or whatever in your community. In general, Amazon is a real company with real products and real systems that work and that is generating wealth. Elon Musk is a great visionary entrepreneur. I don't deny it. I admire him. And I think he has tremendous flair and creativity, and I agree with his general vision that we got to do big things, that we got to escape this sort of narrow, incremental, static vision. Peter Thiel is a great man and a philosophically profound thinker and really the greatest entrepreneur of our time. I think he's really, I'm working with him. So because we love Peter Thiel, we may actually underestimate him. I think, and I've been reading business books all my life, and I have never read a better business book than Peter Thiel's 0 to 1. It is a great book. It captures perfectly our predicament and is just full of insights. And anybody who wants to be an entrepreneur today should read 0 to 1.
What do you think of Peter Thiel's project to fund young people in their startups? These young people, they choose to develop their idea and forego the traditional 4 years at a university.
Was a founding partner of 1517, which is his fund for these Thiel Fellows. And the Thiel Fellows are transforming the world. It's an astonishing success. And the most prominent and luminous of them is Vladimir Buterin, the founder of Ethereum. By himself, he's launched with the team, obviously, but he's led a team that's created an entirely new vessel for entrepreneurial capital. They've raised, I think, close to $8 billion now on the Ethereum platform. And the ERC-20 ICOs, these are initial coin offerings, crypto offerings, whatever, Cayman offerings. They're ICOs that have responded to the crisis in IPOs. And the SEC managed to suppress IPOs. And I really devoutly hope that they think closely before they do for ICOs what they did for IPOs. 90% drop. If there's a 90% drop in the subject of your regulatory authority, maybe you should, unless you believe that IPOs are somehow a form of crime, you should rethink it before you move on to try to regulate ICOs, which have really replaced IPOs. And They're an amazing phenomenon which Teal Fellow Valeric Buterin launched with a whole system, Ethereum blockchain, with a new software language called Solidity that programs, automated contracts, digital automated organizations, and new IPO, really new ways of raising funds through selling different forms of pre-selling with different forms of value. And this is just amazing, the array of creative activity that has sprung from that Teal Fellow. Silicon Valley has the idea that self-driving cars are really going to spring from machine intelligence, that somehow these cars are going to learn through software what's in front of them and how to respond to every conceivable It's not possible through, it's not a software problem. It's a hardware problem. And another Teal Fellow named Austin Russell has started a company called Luminar. It's been in stealth for 5 years, and it's completely redefined the sensory systems for self-driving cars, resulting in a 50-fold greater resolution and radically faster response time, and as well as faster software processing, because they integrate the processing of the information with the sensors themselves. And they use a new frequency band, which doesn't affect human eyes, so they can use 60 times more power. They just have completely redefined the LiDAR systems that are the vision systems for cars. And there's another Teal Fellow that's creating mobile data centers. I mean, these cars are going to have to be kind of mobile data centers. And so creating mobile data centers is another great feature of life after Google, where these big data centers next to rivers tied to a bunch of windmills, and it's just, the whole thing is a joke from my point of view. These are not people who are going to rule the next era. This is the end of the line for the old era, according to Bell's Law. Bell's Law is Gordon Bell, who is a great figure at digital equipment, now is at Microsoft. And he says that Moore's Law is every couple of years, the number of transistors on a chip can double. It's essentially a learning curve. And Bell's Law is that every 10 years there's between 100 and 1,000-fold rise in computer cost effectiveness. And that requires a completely new computer architecture. And the cloud computing architecture that currently dominates and has reached this hopeless crisis in security is going to be replaced over the next decade. We've had the 10-year ride for cloud computing. I wrote the first major article about cloud computing in Wired in 2006. Well, it's now 12 years later, and we've had Bell's Law 10, 12 years. Architecture is emerging, and that new architecture is based on cryptography, blockchains, hash chains, just all these new technologies that the crypto movement has engendered.
Our final question, since PRI is close to wine country and we all love wine at PRI, we always ask every guest to give our listeners a recommendation for their favorite wine.
I like Zinfandel. I'm a Zen man. Just because I'm also a writer, I'm intrigued by writer's block.
Oh, I love writer's block.
And I think writer's block comes from Sonoma County.
Right.
And my daughter, who helped me write Life After Google, spent a lot of time in Sonoma County, and I visited her a lot there, and Bodega Bay.
That's a wonderful wine. Well, thank you so very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
It's a pleasure. Thanks to our special guest, George Gilder, and do pick up his fascinating new book, Life After Google. And on behalf of the PRI team, I'd like to thank all of our loyal listeners for staying with us as we toast our 50th podcast. Thanks for listening. I'm Rowena Itchon. We hope you'll come back again for another episode of PRI's podcast.